Our third speaker is Gavin Mcmahon, who's the Chair of the National Irrigators Council. Gavin is also currently the CEO of the Central Irrigation Trust and a Director of Central Irrigation Limited. In that role, is responsible for delivering irrigation water to 1,200 farming families and 14,000 hectares, 1,200 families farming 14,000 hectares of the riverland in South Australia, as well as 3,000 domestic customers and 17 industries. He's heavily involved in water industry issues within the Riverland District and across the Murray-Darling Basin. Prior to the CIT, Gavin spent 23 years with the Bureau of Sugar Experimental Stations and also in that role servicing research and development and primary producers in the sugar industry. He has a BSc from Griffith University, where he majors in environmental studies, as well as a Bachelor of Business from the University of Southern Queensland. I suspect both those are very handy in his current role. Please welcome Gavin.
Thanks, everybody. Thought I'd start off just to reflect on where I live, and when I look out the windows here, I really believe I live in probably the best part of Australia. I'm one of the 2 million, by the way. So if you have a look at the slide on the screen, you'll see the left-hand one is a night picture over Lake Bonnie at the town of Barmera, looking out to the arid lands of the north and the northern deserts. We've got our office. We've been there for nearly 100 years. That office building's 80 years old. Beautiful place to work. And that's, pardon me, that's the Murray River at the end of our street in the township of Berry. On a busy day, there's a couple of boats on the river. So a really, really beautiful place to live and some very special features, and I'm glad I live there, and every time I visit here just reinforces that. So some of the important things that have come out today is that for the people that actually live in the basin, we actually know it intimately. We know our part of that basin inside out. So it's not just about a place to live for us. Most of our work involves there as well. So you can see that's our pumping station. We run 13 of those. They're on each lock in South Australia. So we understand the flows in the river. We understand the salinities in it. We also use it for recreation. And so you can see again some of our family there. Our recreation in summer, a little bit too cold right at this point of time. But again, you understand the events that are coming through. Blackwater events, we let them pass and we go back in again. And also on the floodplains, you know, we go mountain bike riding down there, you can see what happens to the ecology there. So we do understand the river system, we understand it quite intimately. Even our children, that's my daughter doing agriculture at school, understands what the river means to our region. I'll just take you on a quick trip through where I live and what I do. I think that helps to actually, as the presentation goes on. That's one of our pumping stations, so we extract water from the River Murray, that's in Lock 4 at Loxton. We push it through some machinery, a pumping station, that's a $20 million investment there, fully automated, nobody's there. We get a phone call when something goes wrong. We pressurise that, we then put in a pipe, we send that to a farmer who will filtrate it, then sends it to his crop. Generally in our region it's off trickle or under tree irrigation, and he'll monitor that. And we find probably about 95% efficient delivery from that point to this point here. Really high tech, really high investment, but very efficient water use. And also, you need some people with some skills to actually do that. It's not just run-of-the-mill horse and cart type stuff, it's actually quite sophisticated machinery. We produce some really great products, and Berry was always famous for berry fruit juices. It's actually left the region, but we've got fruit juice companies like Nippy's and Charlie's, Goulburn Valley as well. We've got a significant, probably the heart of the almond industry, a $2 billion export industry. Big in wine production, so we've got Berry Estates, the second largest winery in the southern hemisphere. Big citrus industry, stone fruit, dried fruit, and some really also burgeoning industries in terms of capers. The guy from Capers actually sells at the high-end markets in Sydney, and also an emerging date industry, which is one that's really suited to climate change, needs some hotter units and the like. So our area produces a lot of dollars, export dollars, about $500 million is produced annually out of our region, It contributes to both the national economy, our state's economy, and it contributes significantly to jobs. So as we went into the Millennium Drought, these are the things that we were faced with, and these were some of the eminent scientists and just some of the quotes that came out. Death and destruction of the wetlands, urgent call to prayer for the dying River Murray, national disaster. That's what we were told. When we sat there, that's a photo of the river system just upstream of the Kingston Bridge. That's what it looked like in the middle of the drought. Didn't quite look dead to us. Didn't quite look like it was in collapse. Were we going through hard times? Yes, we were, but certainly not to the extent that was published in the press. So that diminishes our view of science a little bit when those sort of predictions were there, but those predictions never came to fruition. Was there a need for change? I think there was, and I won't add to the other speakers, but obviously extractions continued to expand from 1920s or the settlement, white settlement, right through to 2000s, and the river was over-extracted. I guess the discussion and debate has been really about how much. So was there a need for change? Yes, there was, but as it was previously said, change was actually occurring. You had change occurred right back in 1915 with the Murray Waters Agreement, but you had a cap on extractions in South Australia in 1969. So South Australia realised in 1969 the system needed some change. Cap on diversions in 1995, Living Murray in 2003. So the Murray-Darling Basin Plan itself wasn't a Kickstarter, it wasn't historic in that event. Change was already there and change was occurring. The Water Act was really driven by the Millennium Drought, and that Millennium Drought was a historic drought. So up to date, what's been achieved? And I think there's been a lot achieved, and I'll just take you through some of them. And I think it's things that we should celebrate. Actually, I don't think we celebrate our achievements well enough, but what has been achieved? First of all, most of our communities survived the Millennium Drought. So Millennium Drought is a historic event. And if you think about historic events, you'll think about tsunamis, you'll think about floods. Droughts are really insidious, they creep up on you. Our communities are all still there, our farmers are still operating there. Some of the things that were in the Water Act assisted that. So things like freeing up a water trade certainly allowed those with permanent plantings to secure water from more broadacre areas. That put water into our systems, kept trees alive, and it put money back up into places that couldn't grow crops. There's been a natural recovery, so all the doom and gloom that was there during the drought, we found in 2011-12 some historic floods. You see some floods in the Upper Murray and Upper Murrumbidgee, and in our part of the river system, even though you had those historic floods up there, all we had was actually a high river level, so the flood peak flattens out. But even with that, we got some regeneration. You can see the regeneration down on the floodplains with some of the river red gums in our area. So there's been a recovery from the drought, and the floodplains actually look quite okay as you start to go through them. I think a really important thing has actually been the focus on infrastructure and the change from buying back water to looking at other solutions and solutions that can provide benefit both to our communities but also to the river system. So with infrastructure, you're not necessarily taking productive water out of our communities, you're actually building other ways to do things and smarter. If you have a look, this is a chowler regulator upstream of Ranmark. Regulator's got a fishway. Sorry, if you can just see there's a fish passage back up through that regulator. Can flood enormous parts of the chowler floodplain. So there's areas that can be flooded, and they can be flooded at will. So you can flood them as and when's required. You can bring back some of the smaller floods and get recruitment on the floodplains. So we think investment in infrastructure is really worthwhile. You can get some really good outcomes and not at the expense of our communities. The other thing is governments have accumulated really large quantities of water. So Arlene's shown you the recovery to date, quite substantial quantities of water. People talk about the 2750, but can I tell you there's a Living Murray, which was another 500 gigalitres that was secured. State governments have got a whole heap of water squirreled away in accounts as well. And so there is also the establishment of environmental water trusts as well. So there are large quantities of water now actually being recovered by the government. I guess when I look at it, there was one way that water was being recovered. It was by a program called Water for Rivers, and you can see Neville Smith, who was the CEO there of Water for Rivers, they actually went out and recovered that prior to the Basin Plan, and they actually did that by working with communities, and it was a lesson that we never took through and into the Basin Plan. And if you have a look, those guys recovered 314 gigalitres for $415 million, quite a good investment, with little impact on the communities. I think another really good thing is to choose learning to use its water. So the Murray-Darling Basin Plan will give them a plan about how to use it, but when you talk to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, he actually says it doesn't actually quite work the same way as the models say. So he's actually learning how best to use it. And I think that's a really good thing. He's learning that the models don't tell him how to do it, how best to do it. He's also making partnerships with organisations, and so we've done one with them on Lirrup Forest Reserve, where we've put some water into a flood runner for a brine shrimp breeding event. And so that's a really good thing, starting to bring localism into action. I think there'll also be some innovative thinking for adaptive management, and you've heard the terms, but you haven't seen too many examples of them, and they are few and far between. But certainly DPIW in Wentworth are looking at lowering lock levels. So we've talked about raising and pushing water back in the floodplains. These guys can lower one or two of their locks about 1.5 metres and actually get some recruitment down into the river system. And I think that's really innovative, and that's the sort of things that we need to look at as we start to manage this water. We've got some state-of-the-art irrigation systems as a result of the investment. If you have a look, that's Colliamberley, that's a channel system. They've achieved efficiencies in excess of 90% for a channel delivery system. That's outstanding. It's world class. The infrastructure that you can see there, particularly these here are Rubicon systems. They're called total channel control. So they give you minuscule micromanagement of those systems. That's now become a company that's selling that technology internationally. So we've actually also developed another export industry as a result of that investment. I think also solutions other than water need to be thought about. So it's not just a matter of pumping water down a system. In Chowla, where they do that, if you don't look at the feral pigs and the feral goats and the responses that you get from adding water actually aren't as great as they can be. So we need to look at a broad range of things. Can I say our communities have really done that, and I'm proud of it, with no contributions from the major cities or towns. So if you have a look in the guide to the Basin Plan, Canberra was supposed to yield up 4 gigalitres of water. When the Basin Plan was revised and implemented, Canberra didn't yield up anything. And do you know what Canberra actually did? They built a bigger dam to store more water. If you look at Adelaide, draws 200 gigalitres. They yield 6 gigalitres up. For that, they got a $2 billion desalination plant. Melbourne, what's Melbourne actually doing towards it? They put a pipeline back up and into the river system so that they can extract water out of the river system. So you want everything to happen. Everybody likes to look over the range, but they're not actually prepared themselves to contribute to the process, and that's one of the things that really frustrates our communities. So what's left to go? I think there's been enough. 2016 is a really important year, the SDL adjustment mechanism. The things that our communities are looking for is really for that SDL adjustment to be as high as possible. The 650 gigalitres that the states reckon that they could get, we want to see that 650 gigalitres. We don't want to see 500. We actually want to see them recover 650 gigalitres. If they recover 650 gigalitres, it's an extra 150 that doesn't come out of our communities. Obviously, understanding the socio-economic impacts are important, and I think that's really important not just for this plan but for any future plans that are developed up. And while Colin's given you all of the good things in the Riverina, what he hasn't showed you are some of the things that are closed down around the place. And so when they come to our region in the Riverland of South Australia, a lot of that processing has actually disappeared from the region. Milk factories will start to disappear as there's some readjustment. So there's readjustment of crops, but there will be an impact from the plan, and we think that you really need to understand that. We think managing constraints are really important. So there's a whole heap of constraints in the river system. You've got to remember the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is a plan to flood. And so in flooding, you will flood properties, you'll flood infrastructure that's there, and if you can't remove those constraints, then you've got to really reassess why are we recovering as much as we did. So without the management of those constraints, the 450 gigs of upwater that has been spoken about really doesn't have an impact, and will recover another large volume of water for minimal impact. I think monitoring and evaluation is really important. I'm glad to see it's on the priority list of the previous two speakers, because we will be holding them to account for that. Huge investment, but the models say this was going to happen. Did it actually happen? And if not, why not? So certainly our communities and our organisations will be looking at that intensely. We don't believe it's strong enough. We believe the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder will monitor what he does, but we're not sure whether that's strong enough across the basin. There's a whole heap of legacy costs that will still be left to bear, and the legacy costs are things like the Environmental Water Holder actually is the biggest irrigation holder, entitlement holder in the basin. He's got a lot of costs associated with that, and can I say, as a business, we understand what those costs are because we have to pay them, and there is no money in the future outlook or the future estimates for how that's to be funded. Funnily, most of it's been funded out of 13 million to date, so it's actually been shuffling the decks there. We also think there's a lot of room for streamlining the processes. So there's been a big bureaucracy that's built up around the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. You've got MDBA, you've got the CHU, you've got the states involved, you've got various organisations, and it looks messy from the outside, and we believe that it is messy in its operations, and feedback that we get personally says that it's not as streamlined as it could well be. We think there's some really big gains and efficiencies that can be made in streamlining those processes. And as Arlene said, I think there's still a need to help some of the communities adjust, those communities that are poorly affected, but the reality is you leave them out to dry and they'll just have to deal with it themselves. So just some messages to finish off on. Our communities don't have the faith in science that everybody else has, so I don't believe science is always right, particularly in the exploratory phase. If you look at the modelling, there's always massive assumptions in there, and so you've got to ask the questions, are those assumptions right? And if you look at the sugar debate now that's occurring, you know, people change their views, science changes its views. I think adaptive management is really important. Really, the Living Murray was an adaptive management program, and I think that was actually the best process forward. Was you actually recovered an amount of water, saw what you could do with it, then you make some decisions once you've got that. The trouble with the basin plan is it's just gone the whole hog and said, here's the number and this is what we'll do, whereas the Living Murray actually stepped through that process, and I'm sure we would have had better outcomes had we followed a process like that. I think that we really need to be innovative, and not just from our agricultural pursuit, but really from the environmental pursuit. The agricultural and the communities in the basin are innovative. And I know from our own region, and as I showed you David Riley, who's introducing a whole new crop, that's all about innovation, but that needs to happen in the environmental field as well. How do we make best use of the water that's there? I keep urging, don't forget the total picture. So the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is about recovery of water, but it's also about communities. There's 2 million of us there. We want to grow as well as everywhere else. So how do we actually make that 2 million turn into 2.5 million? I think there is a lot more than just add water and those associated programs that have to go with it. And unfortunately, they're the programs that the federal government are cutting. So caring for our country, those type of activities, if you put water on, you have a benefit. Are you just going to grow pigs and goats to then ravish that area? And I'll leave you with a final message, is that after a decade of significant change, and I say of significant change, our communities went through the millennium drought. We had the Murray-Darling Basin Plan thrust upon us. We actually want to slow down now. We want some certainty, and we want the rest of you to nick off for a little while. Thank you.